This is Blood and Cancer, the official podcast of MDedge Hematology Oncology. And welcome to episode 124 of Blood and Cancer, the final B and C, well, sort of, the final interview show from Blood and Cancer for the year 2020, and what a year it's been. I'm joined by the editor-in-chief of MDedge Hematology Oncology, Dr. David Henry. And Dr. Henry, it seemed like only yesterday that CEOs were hiding in banana crates to escape Japan, and that would not even be a top 100 story. If you might not even know what I'm talking about, you can Google that. That's a fun Google. Well, so welcome aboard, I guess. What a year it's been.
What a year it has been indeed. So, as we record this, we've got winter weather suddenly arriving in the Northeast where you and I are. Suntan 5 days ago, and now boots and shovels today. And arriving also in the country as we record this, this is day 2 of vaccination. The Pfizer vaccine, Moderna, I think, has their FDA meeting this week, and it may actually start to ship again next week. So, I've talked to so many colleagues. This is absolutely phenomenal what has happened from bench to bedside in the same year of some 9-10 months. So what an amazing year in the science.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just a media person, but I had the hot take earlier that this has perhaps been the most jaw-dropping accomplishment in human history. I don't know how out of left field that is, but we sailed the ocean, but people have been sailing for a long time, went to space. I mean, maybe space, maybe the abyss. I mean, this is nuts that there was just a freak out. And there have been coronaviruses before. I don't know how crazy it is to say that it was 1 year, not even a year. We isolated the virus and there's multiple vaccines. It's crazy.
It is amazing. I'm sure of human achievements, this must be the top 10, that we've gone from a world epidemic that could kill so many, that makes so many sick and kill so many. And we're in the process of slowing that or stopping that right now. It's just amazing.
It truly is unbelievable. But I do think that similar to the space race where things like seatbelts and pencils and a bunch of other stuff came as a subsequent secondary part of the space race, so too will be the situation with COVID. There's a lot to learn. We're going to be unpacking the data from 2020 and 2021 probably for a century. So in order to do that, you have to start things like registries.
So Registry. So we're talking about a really interesting interview coming right up with Dr. Wood, who's a major principal of the American Society of Hematology, ASH Registry. And the idea here being that so many societies did this, a pivot as, what's happening in 2021? It's COVID. We better study it. And so we talk about for heme problems, in particular hematologic malignancies, how are these patients doing? So he chairs, and we give the website, you can see it on our website, mdedge.com/hematology-oncology, but we also give the name of it in the interview. Patients are being registered with these problems, and how are they doing? Lots of data going in. His particular study, Registry, is IRB approved, but we go through, because I was very interested, having done with IRBs, you have to be so careful. It's a central IRB, so those anywhere who don't have to be ASH members and can be anywhere internationally can sign on and add patients to this database. They can query the database. And even more interesting is, what do we know in March of 2020? What do we know now in December 2020? A whole lot more. And how are these patients doing in a dynamic picture, not snapshot, but picture from time to time? Are we making progress? Who's happening? What happened to them when in the epidemic?
I think it's the start of something that I suspect will be tapped into for quite some time. And as we look back on the year, Dr. Henry, in terms of how Blood and Cancer has done as a podcast, I think some of the most impactful topics that we've done are things like this, registries, and specifically how COVID and the novel coronavirus has impacted hematologic malignancies. It's been, it was weird when it started. You're like, it's a pandemic, whatever. And as it started to unravel, it had its tentacles into blood, and it really impacted hematology in a way that I'm not sure people would have predicted.
And one thing we mentioned in the interview is the ASH meetings themselves were first weekend in December, and there was a lot of coverage of that. And interestingly, all the CD20 antibodies, rituximab being the first, with many biosimilars, will dial down, of course, your ability to recognize lymphocytes to plasma cells to antibody. So the response among people getting vaccination may not be as robust for 6 to 9 months. Came out of the ASH meeting, and we discussed that in our ASH registry. So treaters need to be aware of what their patients might have gotten with regard to the CD20 antibodies.
So stick around. Coming up right after this, the interview is the final interview that's going to air on this podcast feed in 2020. So let's do something positive, because 2020 has been a year of existential crises, both as a species and as individuals. So let's see. What's our highlight from Blood and Cancer? I think the highlight was when I created a cocktail that I named after a Shakespeare character named Cordelia. That was my highlight for this show in 2020.
That is the highlight. I'm going to take that as my highlight as well, because I can't wait to taste it when we eventually get together, having both been vaccinated. We want to wish all our listeners a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Kwanzaa, and whatever holiday you celebrate. We really appreciate your support this year, and look forward to seeing more of you in 2021.
Well said, Dr. Henry. It's been a pleasure, and I can't wait to do it with you some more in 2021. Stick around. Coming up right after this, our conversation on a COVID registry, Dr. Wood and Dr. Henry.
Thanks, Nick.
Go beyond the headlines and hear the full story on Cleveland Clinic's Cancer Advances podcast. It's the medical professionals' trusted source for exploring the latest innovative research and clinical breakthroughs happening in the field of oncology. From the highest profile cancer trials conducted at our research facilities to understanding how they impact your patients, Cleveland Clinic's world-renowned experts take a deeper look. Listen to the latest Cancer Advances episode by visiting clevelandclinic.org/Cancer Advances podcast.
Welcome to this podcast. I'm your host, Dr. David Henry, and I am delighted today to be speaking with our guest, Dr. Bill Wood, who's Associate Professor of Medicine at University of North Carolina, beautiful place in Chapel Hill. He's also the chair of the ASH, American Society of Hematology Data Hub, and that's actually what we're going to be talking about today. So first of all, Bill, welcome to the program.
Absolute pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me today.
You're welcome. Thank you for taking the time. And so our American Society of Hematology meetings, ASH, just ended the first weekend in December. Probably like you, I spent a lot of that weekend in my home office listening to the presentations, one of which was yours. And first, you might just comment, what was it like? Did you do it live? Did you record ahead of time? How was it making your presentation, oral presentation this year at ASH?
Well, thanks. It was certainly an interesting experience, as I'm sure it was for all the other presenters as well. I first want to thank American Society of Hematology for doing such a tremendous job with the virtual meeting under the circumstances. I know that many professional societies over the past year have been confronted with this issue, and I feel that we've all learned as the year has gone on about best practices in this area and how to make the experience as seamless as possible and attractive to participants as possible. And so I certainly think ASH did a great job. Great. I think from my perspective, personally, what I did in terms of nuts and bolts, I had opportunity to pre-record the presentation, and I think that was done so that there weren't issues on the actual day of the presentation with any audiovisual issues that might have occurred. However, the question and answer session was certainly live, and I think it was a nice blend of having a real-time experience while ensuring that the delivery of the material was as smooth as possible.
Yeah, I had a poster, and what an experience. Of course, they limited our number of slides to 10, including 2 intro slides, so 8 in 5 minutes or less, or they cut you off. So my wife said, "You're speaking awfully fast." I said, "Well, it's a lot of data." So, but I thought the meeting went very well, as you said. 30,000 people, our chairman said, and began with a fireside chat with Fauci, which was really spectacular. So on to what you presented, and I'll name the abstract title, Outcomes of Patients with Hematologic Malignancies and COVID-19 Infection, a report from the ASH Research Collaborative Data Hub. So maybe if you would start by what is the ASH Research Collaborative Data Hub, then we get into what the study did and found.
Thanks for the question, and I think this is a great opportunity to introduce your audience to the ASH Research Collaborative. Maybe I'll actually start there. The ASH Research Collaborative is actually a separate organization that ASH helped to launch in 2018 to help house a couple of programs of particular interest from a research and clinical practice perspective to the Society's members. And the ASH Research Collaborative currently has a few large programs within it. One of those programs is the Data Hub. I'll spend just a few minutes talking about that. And the other program is a clinical trials network. The clinical trials network is actually initially designed for sickle cell disease and is envisioned as an accelerator to help move clinical trials along as quickly as possible through a network of committed sites whose providers and patients and others are all oriented towards a common goal. Those sites are organized under a single IRB and other procedures to increase efficiency as much as possible. The Data Hub is envisioned as a patient-level data resource of information of interest to the hematology community, organized on a disease by disease basis. So the first two diseases that the Data Hub has been organized around are sickle cell disease and multiple myeloma, representative disease from the non-malignant and the malignant side. And within each disease, networks of sites get together for direct EHR integration, as well as data acquisition from extra EHR sources to inform research and clinical practice within these diseases. And so the Data Hub had been ongoing and was really moving along within our two flagship disease areas when the COVID-19 pandemic unfortunately struck earlier this year. And at that time, there was recognition across the hematology community that our patients might be at increased risk for adverse outcomes following COVID-19 infection. And we can talk a little bit more about how we ended up actually developing the registry. But what we did is we launched the COVID-19 Registry for Hematology. And so for clarity, actually, that project, the COVID-19 Registry for Hematology, is distinct from the Data Hub itself, but both are organized under the ASH Research Collaborative, and many of those individuals, including myself, who have been involved in the Data Hub, helped to get the registry off the ground, and those were the data that were presented at the annual meeting.
So I didn't realize that this was actually an ongoing effort before COVID-19 hit. So then this, as many institutions and studies did, they pivot to include what was happening and learn something. So maybe if we could then go on to your presentation. So what did you study? Who was in it, and what did you look for, parameters, and then we'll get into what you found.
Thanks, absolutely. So the COVID-19 Registry for Hematology is a voluntary data contribution registry, which we launched through the ASH Research Collaborative in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, again, with a recognition that patients with underlying hematologic diseases could be at increased risk for adverse clinical outcomes following COVID-19 infection, including morbidity and mortality. So with that in mind, we developed a platform by which providers and other individuals at sites seeing patients with hematologic diseases and COVID-19 infection could log in a secure fashion and contribute data to a centralized repository where it was stored in a secure and de-identified way. We developed these procedures with review through a central IRB, obtained an exemption for this activity. We also ensured that our procedures were GDPR compliant in setting the registry up. And then we worked with providers from around the world to bring data in over the course of the pandemic. At the time that we had written our first paper on our experience, we had about 250 patients that were included. Our updated presentation at the ASH annual meeting included about 656 patients, and in checking the registry website just earlier this morning, I think we're up to about 730 patients at this time. So we continue to bring in data over time from sites both in North America and also around the world.
So if I could interrupt you for a second, Bill, you do not need to be a member of ASH, or you do, and these sites did not need to be IRB approved since you did it centrally.
No, thanks for asking. That's a key question. You absolutely do not need to be a member of ASH to contribute data to the COVID-19 Registry for Hematology. From the perspective of the IRB, it's been an interesting issue, and this is an issue that many voluntary data collection registries in and outside of hematology have experienced, where there remains some questions that local site investigators or institutions have around central IRB exemption. So we certainly went through the central IRB. We acquired that exemption. Many individual site investigators opted to go to their IRBs anyway to ensure that this was appropriate in the view of their local IRBs, and that certainly was fine. And we provided some support for individuals who wished to do that as well.
And we'll include on our website, mdedge.com/hematology-oncology, the website address to look in on this and I guess possibly become a contributor. If someone wants to query you to join the database, they could.
That would be wonderful. It should be a very straightforward process to contribute data. Some sites have contributed 1 or 2 or 3 patient records. Others have contributed 10 or 20 or more. In fact, we're now set up to bring in batch data submissions from sites that have been organizing their data around their patients with hematologic conditions who have acquired COVID-19 infection and wish to do that. In fact, we had a relatively large batch data submission from Memorial Sloan Kettering, which we were quite grateful for a couple of months back, and other sites are organizing their own data for batch submission as well.
What's the name of the website? Just while we'll post it, but if you could say it in case our listeners want to try it when they hear this.
I think the best approach is to go to www.ashrc.org. That is a main ASH Research Collaborative website. It should be fairly easy to navigate from there to the COVID-19 Registry for Hematology. I'll just make one more note while we're talking about it, what other users can expect to experience from that website, whether or not they wish to actually contribute data. One of the goals of this registry very early on in the pandemic was to bring information back to hematologists as quickly as possible in the event that this could potentially inform clinical practice in some way. And so with that in mind, the website actually offers data summaries. So if one navigates to the COVID-19 Registry for Hematology and then clicks on data summaries, you can see at any given moment in time, and we usually try to update every day to every couple of days, exactly what we've experienced in terms of our data collection to date.
Well, that's terrific. What a nice resource. Well, on to your presentation. So now that we have the background, and I'm already interested in checking this website out myself, what did your study and what did you find?
So what we studied in terms of the data that we collected, we obtained information on individuals with underlying hematologic diseases. And so we acquired information about the nature of the underlying disease, recent treatments that might have been received up until the COVID-19 diagnosis and the recency of those treatments. We had basic background sociodemographic information. We acquired information about the COVID-19 infection itself in terms of symptoms, in terms of time to resolution, or unfortunately, if the case resulted in mortality. We learned about COVID-19 directed treatments, and we acquired some other pieces of data as well. We asked about the expected prognosis irrespective of the COVID-19 infection. So in the physician's estimation, what was the prognosis at the time of the infection itself? And then also whether or not the patient opted for intensive care related to severe infection. And with that in mind, looking at those data, we found that overall we reported a 20% mortality in our population of those individuals with underlying malignant hematologic diseases who acquired a COVID-19 infection. And if you looked at those individuals with at least hospitalization level severity, that mortality was about 33%. So I think the first conclusion was that patients with underlying malignant hematologic diseases are a medically vulnerable population when it comes to COVID-19 infection. The other major finding, I think, was that risk was differentially distributed. And so some of the risk factors that we've seen in other non-hematologic populations were certainly true in our population as well. Clearly increased risk with age for severity and mortality. And a number of other factors were also associated with adverse outcomes, including underlying prognosis and the state of the underlying malignant hematologic disease.
So a clarification, you weren't screening people walking in and out of clinics. You were waiting till someone was COVID-19 admitted ill. Was that the substrate? Well,
to actually kind of get to a point just in between those, we're not screening. However, we were waiting until somebody was diagnosed. And so they did not need to be admitted to a hospital. In fact, many of the patients that were reported had outpatient level severity and were never hospitalized. But the entry criteria was anyone who a provider knew to have had underlying hematologic disease and COVID-19 infection.
Okay, and then on to how outcomes might occur. This is a moving, dynamic study, which you're reporting. So March, and right up, we're recording now in December, just after the ASH meeting. So, of course, we've gotten better taking care of these patients. We've had some emergency approvals of things like remdesivir or antibodies or even dexamethasone, which was surprisingly helpful. Did you find over time, at that 9-month stretch, things improved or stayed the same? Any difference there?
That's a great question. And I think we do have hints in our data that there may have been some improvement in our population as well. So for example, if you look at our paper that was published in Blood Advances for the first 250 patients, we reported a mortality of 28%. In the updated presentation at the ASH annual meeting, the reported mortality was 20%. With that having been said, because of limitations around the de-identified data storage, we did not have exact dates of diagnosis. And so while one might infer that outcomes were improving over time, it's hard to say that with definitive certainty. We're also able over time to look at how treatments have changed. And so because we're asking about COVID-19 directed therapies, we can see, for example, how patients might or might not have received hydroxychloroquine or azithromycin or remdesivir or convalescent plasma at different stages of the pandemic as time went on.
Interesting. And then something else I learned in listening to the meetings this past weekend was that rituximab patients, we know, of course, it's a CD20 antibody. There's others besides rituximab. So we'll say any CD20 antibody that can affect those lymphocytes, they make plasma cells, they make antibody. And this one presentation said, those people may not respond to infection as well. Of course, it begs the question, vaccine. Did any of that pop out in your study data?
Great question again, and that's not something that we specifically looked at for the purpose of this particular analysis. However, we do attempt to collect reasonably detailed data around the underlying hematologic diagnosis and treatments received for that diagnosis, and those treatments certainly could include rituximab. So as data accumulates in the registry, that's a particular question of interest to see if prior rituximab exposure or prior recent rituximab exposure was associated with certain outcomes following COVID-19 infection. That's certainly a question that can be investigated.
Well, I guess toward one of the final questions is where you're going with this. The study is still open. You're still accruing sites, whether individuals or large data submissions. What's next with this as it goes forward, or even anything with regard to the ASH Research Collaborative you want to mention?
Well, thanks for asking. Actually, I think that takes us back to our initial conversation at the outset of our discussion. And I think that there's a couple ways to move forward within the ASH Research Collaborative, one within the COVID-19 Registry for Hematology, and then perhaps within the Data Hub itself. And so I'll start with the COVID-19 Registry for Hematology for a moment. We are continuing to accumulate data, as you've noted. We are encouraging batch data submissions. A point I should also bring up is that even though this registry started, and even though the data that we reported were in the context of malignant hematologic diseases, we actually did partway through expand the registry scope. And so we're collecting data on patients with underlying non-malignant hematologic diseases as well, in addition to hematologic complications of COVID-19 infection. So if any provider is seeing a patient with any underlying hematologic disease and COVID-19 infection or a hematologic complication, we certainly encourage data submission. We try to make that as easy as possible. And again, if you go to the website, www.ashrc.org, you can see how to do that. So in the short run for the registry, as data accumulate, we're interested in more focused analyses of the data that we've accumulated. You mentioned a very interesting question about rituximab. There are other more focused analyses that others might be interested in as well. And then pivoting to the Data Hub for a moment, again, our Data Hub right now is set up for sickle cell disease and multiple myeloma. We have plans to expand to a variety of other non-malignant and malignant hematologic conditions. And one thing that we can do moving forward for both this pandemic and, if we have other exposures of interest in the future, if there are other situations like the one we've experienced in 2020 that happened down the road, we can incorporate those diagnostic phenotypes into our data collection within site electronic health records as we integrate those data sources into the Data Hub. And so we'll be able to know in a more denominator-based way, at least at the site level, within particular hematologic populations, who is acquiring the infection, what the outcomes are. And we can investigate additional questions that we might not have thought of in the registry because we'll have the entirety of the data available rather than specified case report forms that we developed at the outset. So moving forward, I can see the Data Hub being leveraged for this. And the other way in which we can actually look at the Data Hub more generally is around how can we develop risk mitigation strategies to help our medically vulnerable patient populations. And perhaps that is along the lines of more intensive COVID-19 surveillance testing, eventually, hopefully sooner rather than later. That's along the lines of safe and efficacious vaccine distribution. And we're hopeful that efforts like the Data Hub will be able to facilitate those types of activities as well.
Well, I'm just shaking my head at how amazing what you just said is, that we're able to pivot and go gear up something so fast. If there's been any good out of this COVID-19 infection, it's been how we've all come together. Here we're in our hematology specialty, but all the other specialties, whatever they might be in medicine, have done similar things using all this electronics. It's just amazing. The rituximab you mentioned comes to mind, and subsets and demographics and phenotypes. I remember they also present our meetings this past weekend on complement genetic variation, and how that might be how one person has COVID-19, never knows it, another has terrible morbidity or mortality in days. And we're all sitting in cytokines and complement and things that could really hurt us if they go the wrong way. And this kind of data registry you have, which can change immediately to add something that the investigators can then put in, is phenomenal. So I really applaud what you've done and your presentation. Again, if those want to visit the ASH website and see you speak at this presentation, it was entitled Outcomes of Patients with Hematologic Malignancies and COVID-19 Infection, a report from the ASH Research Collaborative Data Hub. And we've been speaking with Dr. Bill Wood, Associate Professor of Medicine at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where he is also the chair of the ASH, American Society of Hematology Data Hub. Bill, thanks very much for taking the time. Really very informative. Really enjoyed it.
Been a pleasure. Thanks again for having me.
And that's it for episode 124 of Blood and Cancer. This is our final episode for the year 2020. There will be a best of episode available for episode number 126. Blood and Cancer is produced by MDedge editor Jennifer Smith. All of our shows are produced by MDedge executive editor Kathy Scarbeck. The host of the show is Dr. David Henry.